Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride. And in a little moment we'll be speaking to Professor Kirstine Rummery and Professor Linda Bald about the coronavirus pandemic. But first, tonight's news headlines. And we start as we always do with our coronavirus statistics update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 750,529 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 724,011 were confirmed negative, 26,518 were positive. There were 558 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, which is a new record high. This will be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will necessarily display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. Of the people who have tested positive, 89 were in hospital last night, 11 of whom were in intensive care. And at the time of putting tonight's broadcast together, neither the UK nor the Scottish Government had published a new number of deaths. A joint statement on COVID-19 by the UK Government, Northern Ireland Executive, Scottish Government and Welsh Government has been issued today. It highlights that a second wave is beginning and makes a shared commitment to bringing the pandemic back under control. The statement also commits the four national governments to clear communications, sharing of knowledge and resources, coordination and cooperation where possible, and clarity where approaches differ between the four nations. It also includes a call for the public to pull together and follow government guidance to help drive down case numbers and get back to some semblance of normal life. The Chancellor is under mounting pressure to step up to the challenge to protect jobs, businesses and people's livelihoods after a leading think tank warned that his winter economic plan will fail to prevent mass job losses and will deliver a deep hit to households. In its findings, the Resolution Foundation concluded that the plans will far from halt a rise in unemployment, that due to flaws in the post-furlough scheme, the UK is on course for a major squeeze on living standards in the months ahead, and that while households have to date been protected from the worst of the economic hit from the pandemic, that is about to change. The coming rise in unemployment will mean a major living standard squeeze for families this winter. Scottish Green, Highland and Island MSP John Finney has called on the Conservative convener of the Scottish Parliament's Rural Economy Committee to call UK ministers before it to explain how chaotic Brexit plans will impact Scotland's food producers. In a letter to Sir Edward Mountain, Mr Finney highlights recent reports that queues of 7,000 port-bound trucks could be delayed for up to 2 days in Kent, where hauliers would require a Kent access permit to enter, and the need for the committee to understand the impact this would have on Scotland's food exporters. Novavax Incorporated today started a late-stage trial of its experimental COVID-19 vaccine in the UK, in partnership with the government's Vaccines Task Force. The study is expected to enrol up to 10,000 participants aged between 18 and 84 years and comes after the vaccine candidate produced high levels of antibodies against the novel coronavirus in a small, early-stage clinical trial. Data from the trial, likely over the next 4 to 6 weeks, will support regulatory submissions for licence in the UK, EU and other countries. The company has previously said it expects to file for US approval of the vaccine in December. A counter-terrorism investigation has been launched in France after 2 people were seriously injured in a knife attack near the former offices of satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo in Paris. French media reported that 2 suspects have been arrested. Paris police headquarters said the victims' lives were not in danger and that no one else was wounded. A man reportedly wearing blood-stained clothing and carrying a large knife or machete was detained near the Place de la Bastille in eastern Paris shortly after the attack, police said. French media reported a second suspect had been arrested near the Richard Lenoir metro station. Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny said today he owed his life to the pilots who made an emergency landing when he collapsed on a flight last month, and the paramedics, he said, had diagnosed poisoning and injected him with atropine. Navalny thanked his unknown good friends in the latest of a series of Instagram posts charting his gradual recovery from the poisoning, which German, French and Swedish laboratories have established was carried out with a nerve agent. Russia denies poisoning him and says it has seen no evidence. The Scottish Greens have warned other parties they are ignoring the climate breakdown as pupils strike today in an urgent call for action. There is global strike action today by the Fridays for the Future movement, led by Greta Thunberg, including distanced events in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Inverness, Aberdeen, Fort William and Dumfries and Galloway. Commenting, Scottish Green co-leader Lorna Slater said, "The young people striking today recognise that the climate breakdown we are witnessing presents an existential threat to our survival. Wildfires, droughts, melting ice caps and landslips are a part of our daily news cycle, yet we have politicians still looking for answers in technology that hasn't been developed yet, such as electric planes or carbon capture and storage." The £200,000 Scottish Veterans Fund is now open for bids from projects that improve the lives of former service personnel and their families. The 2020-21 fund, supported by the Scottish Government and Standard Life Aberdeen, will also consider projects that recognise the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Since the fund's inception in 2008, more than 170 projects have been supported, receiving more than £1.6 million. First-time buyers have one more week to apply for the Scottish Government's pilot First Home Fund, which has helped thousands to enter the property market. The new scheme has been particularly popular since the housing market reopened in June and is expected to support more than 8,000 households into home ownership by the end of the financial year. Home buyers who are completing purchases this financial year have until 6 p.m. on the 2nd of October to apply. And Europe's largest marine protected area has been announced by Natural Environment Minister Marie Gougeon. The new MPA off the west of Scotland will give additional protections to some of the deepest parts of Scotland's seas, protecting Scotland's unique deep-sea marine ecosystems. The addition of the site will mean more than 30% of Scotland's seas are now covered by MPAs, taking Scotland past the proposed new global target for 2030 currently being negotiated by the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. The designation of this site is part of a final package of MPAs that aim to reach the international target of 10% global MPA coverage by the end of 2020. And that is all the news headlines for today. And so now we take you to that interview recorded just a little bit earlier today with Professor Kirstine Rummery and Professor Linda Bauld. So I'm joined now by Professor of Social Policy at Stirling University, Kirstine Rummery. Kirstine, how are you doing tonight?
I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent. And on the other side, we have Professor of Public Health at the University of Edinburgh, Linda Bauld. Linda, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm very well, Kenny. Nice to see you again.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have both of you, and we're going to just have a look at the way that the coronavirus pandemic has developed up to now. So where we are today, we have 558 new cases. That's a record high. Linda, I wonder, is this just down to the universities that we've been hearing so much about in the last couple of days?
I think this the very high numbers over the last few days in particular, Kenny, have been significant proportion of those have been students. I know that from what the Scottish Government has said and also what colleagues involved in the system have told me. So, we could have predicted that, but aside from the students, there is an upward trajectory, and we do know that have been a rising number of cases across all of the mainline health board areas.
And what's driving some of these other spikes that we've seen? Is it people just not sticking to the rules? Is it just people having gone back to work, gone back to school, and there's just more contact happening now?
Yeah, as we released lockdown a little while ago and things began to open up, because we suppressed the virus to a low level, but we didn't eliminate it, it's inevitable that it starts to spread. We see that in countries around the world. And people obviously are moving around the country. And so once you start transmission, it's very hard to get on top of it. We've got a well-functioning test and protect system. But yeah, these rises Scotland is not alone in seeing those.
And does this maybe suggest that we lifted some of these restrictions too soon before we'd got to something a lot closer to an actual zero level?
Well, there is a community, including of researchers who've been advocating for zero COVID. But just to be clear, the countries that have achieved that have had a number of advantages. They've had a very robust public health response, and they've been able to effectively close their borders, which is a key distinction. We've not done that in Europe. Governments uniformly have chosen not to do that. They've resorted to voluntary quarantine of incoming travellers, which of course not all people follow that. And then also some of the key bits of the elements of how our society is organized are different from, say, Iceland or some of the Scandinavian countries, which have done better. So there's been lots of mistakes, but there's also not exactly an inevitability to this, but there's definitely, as I say, a global pattern of which Scotland is part.
Now, just on the subject of universities, Kirstine, you're at Stirling, of course, which is quite a compact campus. There's a lot of people all gathered in one place. Do you think it was a mistake to have students coming back into halls? Couldn't we have done this with them staying at home?
There was a combination of things we could have done differently, and you know, this outbreak was not unforeseeable. We all knew that students would be coming back, and we all knew when they would be coming back. I think there are things that could have been in place if we had a more effective test and trace system, so that students could be tested before they came back and then be asked to self-isolate if they were positive. Then a lot of the needs for these very draconian sort of large-scale measures would have been reduced. But within Scotland, you know, the test and trace system is only really up and functioning. And it's also designed to function around smaller, stable communities. What's happening with the universities coming back is large numbers of people coming into a community that was previously quite stable from a whole range of backgrounds. And similarly to how we could have been more severe with people coming in from other countries, we could have been more severe with people coming into communities and dealt with it slightly better.
And you are delivering most, if not all, of your teaching remotely. So students are not actually gathering together in lecture theatres and so on. It does seem to be the halls of residence that have been the big kind of pot of infections. Have you heard from students how they're coping, some that are self-isolating or in fact have COVID-19?
Well, certainly some of the courses that we do, certainly at Stirling, and this will be the same for Edinburgh, you actually have to be on campus to do. We can't teach everything remotely. Certainly our social science students can be taught remotely. And so the ones that I'm seeing that are on campus, it was partly a desire to sort of give students a proper student experience, because the hope, of course, is that for the second semester from January onwards, that we will be able to have more blended learning and we'll be able to have more live teaching. And so students do sort of need to be on campus for that. And there are also, you know, appropriate socially distanced type activities and socially distanced type teaching that we can undertake live. But yes, you're right. A lot of it is remote. A lot of it is online learning. But then if students are actually on campus, you can control the environment. You can make sure that they've got access to broadband. You can make sure they've got access to laptops, etc., which you can't do if students are at home. And some of the gaps that we would see in terms of access between certainly between poorer and better off students would get even wider if they was trying to do all of this from home.
Well, I would like to ask you both a wee bit about how we have got to this situation. So, Linda, I'll come to you first. What do you think the Scottish Government and the UK Government have done particularly well during this pandemic? What are the things that you think we can actually say, well, this worked, this was a good idea?
So the first thing is furlough. So I know there's now been a shift in furlough as it currently is configured is ending in October, and we're moving to a different scheme. But I think that the financial support for individuals, the UK has done many things wrong, but it did that very well. And that my own view is that should have been extended more broadly than it has been. So that's the first thing that I think we've done well. What else have we done well? I think that there's been a divergence across the UK nations. So I think that we have made a huge contribution. Sorry, I've just thought of another thing we've done well. We've made a huge contribution to the science. So the amount of research that's going on, UK funders diverting their funding into COVID-specific studies, studies repurposing themselves, like the big corona gene study that is being run from Edinburgh, that was the Viking study, a genomics study, and that's going to be hugely important. Of course, the recovery trial, which is UK-led, is what told us that dexamethasone can help people who need ventilation, and another steroid as well approved, and they're also now looking at antivirals. And then, of course, the AstraZeneca Oxford team are one of the leaders in the 9 teams globally that are in late-stage trials. So that's brilliant, and science is what's going to get us out of this. And then I think that the communication and the approach has diverged across the 4 nations. And I think that trust in government is highest in Scotland. You see that from UCL's COVID social study. And the communication from the First Minister, I think, continues, and this is just a personal view. She's an outstanding communicator, and she does convey trust, even though not everything her government has done has been well developed or well designed. So those are some of the good things. I'm sure you're now going to ask me about the not good things.
Well, I was actually going to come to Kirsteen about the good things first, okay, and then we'll dig into the bad things. So, Kirsteen, much the same question to you. What do you think has been good about what you've seen from both Scotland's governments?
I think I would echo Linda's point on the research funding, and in my field, not so much the kind of direct health funding, but also the funding for research on the social implications, the economic implications, the way in which the large research institutes and funders have really sort of stepped up and changed direction very, very quickly to do some of this, and also to support, to get some of the research findings into practice. So there are some really good ways of securing the kind of non-academic impact to support policymakers and practitioners. Certainly, I've just been putting together sort of some funding bids with colleagues in other countries, and there is certainly a sense that institutions in those countries are not responding as quickly as we have. I would also say that, you know, the kind of the trust issue is really, really important. We knew this from the beginning. We knew this, that, you know, the public health messages, no matter what they were, if people were going to comply with them, they had to really trust the people that were delivering the information. And I think we have seen that in Scotland in particular, sort of calm heads at the wheel, sort of, and some very, very good joined up messaging, not just from Nicola Sturgeon, but from Jean Freeman, from Jason Leach and public health experts. And so that has seen, I think, you know, a higher degree of compliance, even though we have seen COVID spikes, etc. But they've not been as severe and as high as we've seen in the rest of the UK. But I am struggling, like Linda, to kind of find good examples, because I can think of lots of examples where even me, and I'm not a public health expert in particular, I'm a social policy expert and I'm a citizen, but even I can see that things could have been done differently, could have been done better and had better outcomes. I mean, there's been particularly people who have been impacted, like disabled people, carers, formal carers and informal carers, that we could have predicted and we could have put things into place. But that isn't to say that other countries did any better than us. That's also another thing. There's a little bit of oh my gosh, the UK is doing absolutely terribly, but actually there's not a lot of evidence that is coming out at the moment from other countries, as Linda said, who are in similar situations to us, who are not islands, who can't sort of self-isolate themselves as an entire country, that are doing particularly better than us.
Yeah, but I mean, we do have to accept that just because everyone's bad doesn't mean that's an excuse for us. What do you think we could have done a lot better?
I think we could have predicted some of the impact on disabled people, some of the impact of the withdrawal of health and social care from disabled, and the way in which the health service was very quickly reconfigured to be just COVID. And some of the impact of that is actually going to be worse than the impact of COVID itself. So we've got information coming out now that kind of 50% of social care users have seen formal support reduced or withdrawn all completely. 40% of them, of the disabled people themselves, are taking on extra caring responsibilities. And we could have predicted that. We've seen funding that has gone to local authorities to support these, but it isn't actually reaching the people that it needed to reach. We also see areas where there has been strong co-working and around disaster planning between the third sector, responding much faster and much better than other areas. And again, that sort of learning could have been rolled out much quicker, and so that the impact could have been much less severe in those particular areas.
Mm. And Linda, now you've had a couple of minutes to stew on it. From a public health perspective, what do you think has been what do you think have been the down moments for the two governments?
Okay, so there are some countries that have done much better through this pandemic, aside from New Zealand, Faroe Islands, etc. And those are the countries in Southeast Asia that were prepared, that had pandemic preparedness, particularly for this type of virus. So Vietnam, Taiwan, to a lesser degree, Singapore, South Korea, who now have seen some problems and rises in cases, but they're still managing to contain it. So those countries, Taiwan and Vietnam, if you look at Taiwan's economy, it's really not taken a hard hit at all. So we need to learn from those countries. So the first thing is that it's clear now that our pandemic preparedness was not what it should have been. So we should have been better prepared, even if we didn't know what the virus was that was coming down the track. That's the first thing. The second thing is everybody in the sector who's working on testing will say that that's been a huge challenge from the beginning. My colleagues involved in setting up the Lighthouse Lab in Glasgow, colleagues working on that around the country. Germany was far better organized in getting testing up at scale. We didn't take advantage of the offers from some of the charities and even the universities, etc., quickly enough. And then, we made a decision, Kenny, in March to pause the contact tracing, and we didn't get that set up at scale as quickly as we should have done, although Scotland choosing to continue to invest in the NHS and its public health teams, as has Wales continues to do, is far preferable to the model in England, which is subcontracting out to these large companies. And that's kind of a legacy of disinvestment in public health. So those are things that we should have done better. And then the other big one, obviously, was just learning from Italy and elsewhere and recognizing that the care home sector would be very badly affected. And again, we've heard from people in leadership positions that they recognize that could have been much better handled. So those are some of the, I guess, the public health infrastructure things. And then they're all also, I'm sure you're going to come on to what else we should be doing in future. I've got a few ideas on that as well.
Well, yeah, we will come on to that. You've both mentioned the differences in kind of the tone and the presentation of the First Minister compared to the Prime Minister and his colleagues. How big a difference does that make in public health terms? I mean, you talked about trust being important. How big a difference does that make in the actual outcomes? Is there good research on that?
There is some research. Again, I keep citing the UCL COVID study, social study, which was funded by Wellcome and Nuffield. And, that is a brilliant study, 70,000 people involved. So that does give us some insight. So, most of my work is in behavioral science within public health, and it's absolutely clear that good communication and trust in government can enhance compliance. And you can see that compliance levels with the guidance are slightly higher in Scotland. Trust in government is significantly higher. So the British population probably, through a message of solidarity, have been slightly more willing to engage. I think younger people have struggled with that for very good reasons. Actually, the differences, though, in terms of how we've experienced the pandemic are really quite minor, actually, around the UK. It's not that Scotland's done better significantly than elsewhere. But I think the important thing for me is the months going forward. This is a long haul. It's not a quick fix. We're in it for many months to come. And so that issue of trust and continuous compliance is going to continue to be very important. And that's where I think that we're better placed in Scotland, but only time will tell the importance of that particular feature of our response.
And Kirsteen, there has been kind of a conflict at times between the messaging from Westminster and from the Scottish government. What do you make of the extent to which the media has kind of fed into that and talked about confusing messages, and it's not clear which we're supposed to follow, even down to the BBC talking about cutting the First Minister's briefings? What do you make of the way the media has handled this in Scotland?
I think the media has, in some cases, fallen into the same trap it always does when it's talking about politics in Scotland, and treated this as a unionist versus independent supporting issue. It really, really isn't. And that does cloud the issue, because if you are seen to be supporting messaging that's coming out of the SNP, you're seen to be supporting independence, and if you're seen to be challenging it, you're seen to be on the unionist side, and that is a real red herring that is potentially quite dangerous, because as Linda said, the importance of the trust, and I think what has been a difference in Scottish messaging, but also the way in which it's been reported by the media, is when there have been mistakes, which everybody is always making in this. This is very new territory for all the politicians involved. There have actually been clear apologies and reasons given for changes in direction in policy, which the messaging coming out of the UK government, particularly the UK Parliament, is not that clear. And people also, it's not just about trust, but it's understanding the reasons behind things that actually helps with compliance. We can see this in international studies. Trust in the German system is very, very high. Again, because they have a leader who is a scientist and who understands the science, but communicates that science very, very effectively. And in other situations where the science isn't communicated effectively and knowledgeably, then trust in that science and the compliance goes down. And Linda is absolutely right. What we really didn't appreciate back in March was that this isn't a 6-month massive, great panic, and then it all goes away. And you could see that in the planning. We've just talked about universities returning. There was a huge assumption that everything would be back to normal by September. And we know it's not going to be. We know until something dramatic happens, like all of the research that's going into perhaps, around vaccines and things like that, until that starts showing some fruition, we are not actually going to be able to go back to normal, if we ever are going to be able to go back to normal. So this is an ongoing planning and learning process. And again, this is where Scotland has a slight advantage, and it's nothing to do with who's in leadership, but it is to do with the structure and the governance of it, in that we have a sort of smaller, more close-knit policy-making community. So we've got kind of 32 different local authorities as opposed to the hundreds in the rest of the UK. We've got a very kind of close working relationship between the Scottish government and between regions, and also between the Scottish government and the third sector, who are helping with the messaging, but also helping crucially with the research and helping with the implementation of policies and practices. So an awful lot of the stuff that needs to happen can happen more quickly and more effectively because of the scale of policy making in Scotland. So there we do have a slight advantage in the months coming up.
Well, speaking of the months coming up, we've got new restrictions introduced slightly differently across the four nations in the UK. We've also seen the 4 nations governments producing a joint statement today. Linda, I wonder, what do you think of where these new restrictions have come from? Well, how do you think they're going to work? And do you think this is something that, as Boris Johnson has said, we could be looking at for the next 6 months? Or do you think perhaps the First Minister's slightly more optimistic suggestion that they could be lifted more quickly is more accurate?
Well, we have really good data now, so we know how to find cases, although there's a scientific debate about the total accuracy of testing and etc. But anyway, it's still, the test we have now, the PCR testing, is reliable. So I think that what we've moved from is moving out of lockdown. Then you see localized spikes. You have local restrictions, although another one's just been introduced in Wales actually in the last few hours. So it's certainly going to be put in place around Cardiff, etc. And then, sadly, now we're seeing this spread across mainland Great Britain and also in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. So I think we are going to be living with these restrictions probably for quite a few months. Whether we start to see any loosening of the limit on household interaction, I wouldn't think we will see that in 3 weeks, because 3 weeks actually isn't enough time to really see a change in the data in terms of the trends in cases. But it's good, the important thing again, and this is about good communication, and there is good communication up here, it's about giving people hope and also knowing that there will be a review and that there's regular review and there'll be regular explanation of why things are being maintained. But I also think we need to look, as Kirsten absolutely says, at the people who are most disadvantaged by these restrictions and recognize that there are going to need to be exceptions, with the current one, of course, being this debate about students not being able to go home to self-isolate. That's not workable, I don't think, from my perspective. So we need to be able to continue to modify and adapt to that. But as I said before, we're in this for the long haul. I think we're in this similar situation probably into next year.
Kirstine, you've talked a bit about some of the impact on different types of or different groups of people. How are you looking at this from a perspective? I know you're a disability rights campaigner. How are you seeing this all from that perspective just now?
It's really, really interesting that there is some wonderful good stuff coming out, and there's also some really, really worrying stuff coming out. So let's talk about the good stuff. So the changes to the way in which we work on a daily basis, for example, everything being online that can be online, and discouraging people from traveling into work if they didn't have to, that's actually been hugely beneficial for a lot of disabled workers. Some of whom have been campaigning for a long time for that kind of flexibility and have been told by institutions, no, you can't work from home. Suddenly, when everybody had to work from home, it's become possible. And the technology has backed it up. Of course, there's differentials in that in terms of broadband access and in terms of access to the actual equipment, etc. But we're getting a lot of initial results coming back from disabled workers who are now able to work more flexibly because everybody has to, that actually we could take forward and learn in terms of the world of work going forward. But some of the negative things in particular, because the focus has been on protecting the most vulnerable, which is people who are vulnerable to COVID-19. But that isn't the same subset of people who are perhaps vulnerable to other issues or are disabled or coping with long-term health issues. So, for example, I have to shield because I am vulnerable because of the various illnesses that I have, and also because I'm on immune suppressant drugs. But actually, I'm not vulnerable. I've got a huge network of people around me who are more than willing to help. People who were not shielding, but then had to shield, suddenly found that their coping mechanisms have fallen apart. And what is really, really demonstrated quite clearly is the lack of involvement of disabled people and carers, particularly informal carers and family carers, in planning for the disaster relief and in planning as we go forward. Some of the stuff we're seeing where pockets of good practice around certain, local lockdowns where actually, instead of there being a piecemeal approach, there's been a kind of joined up approach involving the state sector and involving local charities and voluntary sector, has been far more effective than when that has been left to the local charity sector or just the state sector. Things like, emergency food packages were being delivered to people who didn't need them, weren't getting to people who did need them, and when they were getting there, were not necessarily suitable food for people. So there was very much of a kind of quite narrow focus on what kind of help was needed and what kind of help was available. I think we are learning a lot more about that as we come out of it, and a lot of the disability charities are doing their own research about the impact that it's had on people. And also a lot of the stuff that it is quite worrying is that the focus on the workforce, the focus on the health and social care workforce, issues around PPE, issues around support and protection, issues around shielding and self-isolating, that concern has not, and the structures put in place to support that workforce hasn't gone out to the informal care workforce, who are doing pretty much the same kinds of jobs with the same kinds of level of risk, but without access to that formal help and support. They're doing actually 9/10 of the caring work across the UK, and certainly in Scotland. 9/10 of the really intensive hands-on care of people who are vulnerable is done by family members and friends. And there certainly needs to be some learning from that going forward, how to support that particular group. In terms of combining work and combining care, but also just very basics like how we get PPE to that group of people.
And just to ask you to put on your Women's Equality Party hat for a minute as well. We know that the financial impact of COVID has fallen heavily on women, as so often happens in any crisis. What do you make of how I suppose the gendered response from the Scottish Government?
I think the Scottish Government, like the rest of the UK and like most governments, is focused very much on parts of the economy that it can see the impact on. And so it can see the impact on the hospitality economy. It can see the impact on certain areas of the economy that it really wants to get up and running. But it's not really seeing or taking into account the impact on the unpaid economy. And it's not particularly seeing or taking into account the combinations. So the people who've been really, really badly hit are people who've had to juggle childcare or lose childcare and have been trying to work from home and and certainly within lockdown when we had children at home, trying to homeschool as well. We know the research indicates that 90% of that work fell on women. I mean, within my own sector, you can actually see the outcomes already. You see a rise in research papers being submitted by men and an absolute tanking in research papers being submitted by women, because women are taking on the caring roles, not just the childcare and the homeschooling, but they're also much more likely to be doing voluntary help and doing help for older relatives or disabled relatives than the men are, without, being too sort of opportunistic. Well, not opportunistic, but I do have this vision of men withdrawing into the shed and typing up all of their papers while their women folk are running around and doing all of the caring and holding everything together. And of course, all of the caring and holding everything together is actually what is going to get us through the crisis. But the economic impact on women, and again, just to look at my sector, in 5 years' time, when we see there have been no women promoted, when we see a lot of early career researchers who've lost posts because of the withdrawal of funding, the majority of those within certain sectors will be women. The majority of people on short-term research contracts, etc., again, are women. That is going to be hugely impacted and on gender-wise, and we're not even going to see the outcomes for another 4 or 5 years. But we know it's going to happen. So we should be having a gendered response to the disaster recovery. We should be thinking, how do we get out of this with an economy that works better to look after people, but also tries to address some of these gendered inequalities? Because one of the things that external exogenous shocks to the system like COVID-19 does is it gives you the opportunity to step out of path dependency, to step out of the way in which we've always done things, because you have to be creative. You have to find solutions. You have to involve people that might not previously been part of the solution. So there is actually a huge opportunity. And as I said about the scale of policy making within the Scottish government, there's actually a huge opportunity to start doing things better as we come out of this pandemic than we have done previously.
Linda, as we do move forward then, what do you think the Scottish Government in particular needs to be focused on over the next few months?
So the first thing, just again, Christine and I are speaking from our areas of expertise and interest, which is entirely appropriate. So I still work on cancer prevention particularly. And of course, I've seen from my colleagues the way, as Christine's already said, the NHS was diverted to become a COVID health service primarily for many months. And that's going to have huge impacts in the cancer field, the people who've not had their screening, and therefore for the small proportion of people who are screened who do end up with a positive diagnosis for cancer, that will have been missed or delayed. The referrals, urgent referrals from general practice that didn't happen, which mean, again, there will be late diagnosis that has knock-on effects in terms of treatment options, and then the cancer surgeries that were not conducted, the interruptions to radiotherapy and chemotherapy. So getting the NHS, and I know that there's a lot of really good work going on now to get that up and running, but not only repurposing and restarting, but dealing with the backlog. So that's got to be a huge priority for government. That's the first thing. And then obviously the economic recovery, where we're dependent on Westminster for so much of that. But there have been Scotland-specific responses, for example, for the arts sector and other sectors that I think are going to be essential in the months going forward. So health service, economy, and then obviously education, dealing with the current issues around universities, but importantly, keeping schools open. And I think we've had a good restart to the school term. I really hope we can maintain that, even if we are facing future restrictions. And then just, I guess my final point would be this Build Back Better narrative that many of us, Royal Society of Edinburgh, others have formed working groups on. And there is an opportunity to harness more of a digital future and to use that technology. There's an opportunity to look at inequalities in society and how we support the communities that are being hardest hit. There are many good things, probably, even talking about the environment, that will come out of shaping our response. But the immediate priority, Kenny, as you know, is to deal with COVID. And I still think there are many things in Scotland that we need to do to improve our response to protecting people from the virus and making sure that we don't have the morbidity and mortality that we saw earlier in the pandemic.
And just quickly then, Linda, how optimistic are you about a vaccine becoming available in the foreseeable future?
So I'm very optimistic about research outcomes in general on the clinical side. So everybody talks about the vaccine, but let's remember that the vaccine is not the only solution. We don't have a vaccine for HIV. We don't have a vaccine for tuberculosis, of which we have millions of cases around the world every year, over 10 million actually. But we do have treatments. So we will see more treatments for COVID, and that may mean that when people are diagnosed early in the disease, there are treatments they can receive, which mean that the symptoms are far less. And they may not even need to be hospitalized. And then when they are in hospital, there will be other treatments. So that for me is an area. Antivirals as well, which we know people who have a higher viral load have poorer outcomes. So antiviral treatments will be essential as well, or possible. And then, yes, in terms of vaccines, there are over 170 vaccine candidates. So big questions about how effective a vaccine will be, whether it will be effective in all population groups, how long any protection provided by the vaccine will last. But I think all the signs are next year, even by the end of this year, we might see more promising news. And then the big challenge will be logistical. How do you get it out to populations, including countries with fewer resources? So it's an equitable response. But I'm really, really optimistic, Kenny, about all those aspects of treatment and dealing with the virus.
And Kirstine, just to come to you very quickly before we wrap up, how optimistic are you feeling as you look forward?
I think some of the lessons that Linda pointed out around schooling, really, really important to keep schooling going, and that has now become a priority. I think that's really, really heartening. I also think some of the research, not just into the health side of things, but also into the economic and social policy responses to things, are showing some really, really encouraging signs of how we can do this and do this better, so that we actually learn, and we learn positive lessons from it. And I would also say that I am incredibly hopeful about this cohort of people who are starting. We started talking about students and how awful it is for them. But actually, they are an incredibly resilient and resourceful bunch of young people. I think I would have gone to pieces if this had happened to me when I was 18. But actually, they have incredible resources. They've learned how to work online. They've learned how to respond to the crises in their local community, in their families, and so on. And actually, these are the people who, as we go forward in the next 4 to 5 years and have to learn from this, are going to be the ones in positions to put us there. And I'm really, really hopeful about that.
Well, that does seem like at least a very positive note to end on. Thank you very much then to Professor Linda Bauld and to Professor Kirstine Rummery. It's been wonderful talking to both of you. Thank you. So once again, that was Kirstine Rummery and Linda Bauld speaking to me earlier, and we'd like to thank them very much for their time. We'd like to thank you at home for joining us as well. There would be no point in us making these shows if you weren't watching, so thank you very much for joining us. We do ask, though, if you're able to support us financially, please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month helps us to keep growing and keep producing these programmes for you. If you're not able to support us financially, we absolutely understand. The shows will always be free to view online, but you can still make a big difference for us by following us at Broadcast Scot on Twitter, finding our Facebook page, supporting our YouTube channel, subscribing there, and also by finding us on your Amazon Fire Stick. If you use that, it gives you an option to watch the shows on your regular television. All of those things help, and also if you can share the shows around, then it makes a big difference. Your word of mouth is by far the best way to spread the word about what Broadcasting Scotland is and what we do here. And finally, we're always looking for new people to get involved here. If you have some journalistic skills, or you'd like to learn some, or whether you're interested in the technical side of producing TV programmes, There are lots of opportunities here at Broadcasting Scotland, both in front of and behind the camera. So if you're interested in that, then do please get in touch with us. But that is absolutely all we have time for. So thank you again, once again, to Kirstine and to Linda. I'll be back again on Sunday with the full Scottish. But until then, have a great weekend.